Okay, so thank you very much. Questions and observations?
Thank you. Is that on? My name is Gunhild Lenz-Malik, and I'm an adoptive parent of 3 children. They all have disabilities, and I've got one question and one comment, if I may. My question is to Dr. Blackburn and Dr. Reed. I just wondered if in your research you came across any papers on the outcomes of children who have a background of socioeconomic deprivation and are then adopted. And I know you mentioned the later onsets, and actually our daughter was diagnosed last year at 13 with Asperger's, and our other daughter was diagnosed this year with ADHD, and our son was diagnosed at 4 with Asperger's. I just wonder if there's any research that changing the socioeconomic background makes a difference to the children. And then I have a comment to Alison Thompson, but if you would like to answer the question first.
I don't recall any papers in our systematic review that specifically looked at adoption.
No,
at all.
I don't think we have. But I'd be interested to find out.
Exactly,
Actually, I'm sorry we're not much use to you, but certainly in the systematic review, I don't recall any. But we'd have to. There were a lot of papers there. We'd have to go back.
I can also move it on to the adoption community and see if there's any.
Yes, yes.
And my comment to Alison Thompson is I completely understand what it's like. We had to ask for a second opinion. Our local CAMS insisted she didn't have ADHD. We knew it since she was about 5. We then had a second opinion. She was diagnosed this year. She is on Ritalin. It's making some difference. But we have the Educational Tribunal coming up to get her a statement or a health plan because school are in complete denial of her difficulties.
Good luck with the tribunal. We actually went through one following my son's exclusion because I just felt the school had failed him so completely. And it was a complete farce, actually, but we won. It was agreed that it wasn't suitable for my son to go back to that school because the relationship had broken down completely. So good luck with the tribunal.
Can I just respond on the adoption point? There is some interesting research from the US by a researcher called Lorraine Glidden, who several decades ago started a research study that she's continued to follow up over several years, where she focused specifically on people in the States who'd adopted, especially children with Down syndrome, but other disabilities as well. And so she was interested in that group of families who'd made that active choice and followed them over time to see how their children had done and how the families had done. So there may be a rich stream of work there that would be worth looking at for interest.
Thank you. Question at the top there.
Just had a question for Alison, please. First of all, thank you for sharing what you shared today. My role specialises in transition social work. And the starting point for that, as part of the assessment, is how can we help any parent or carers keep going and doing what they're doing. And the services we provide, including personal budgets and everything else, is all about trying to meet that critical need. But when I started this role, one of the parents first said to me, in terms of the chasm between children's services and adult services, it was like looking over a cliff. And she was really, really scared, and that's always stuck with me, that comment. So I just wanted to ask you, what were your experiences of that transition and the kind of gap, obviously, between children and adult services, real or perceived?
I haven't had an experience yet because we're just approaching that point. My son has. I think CAMS for us has been an opportunity for us to go along and for the paediatrician to say, yes, everything's fine, here's another prescription for your doctor, not any more than that. And when my son decided last year that he was going to stop taking his medication, CAMS said, oh, well, you don't need us now. I actually insisted that they carry on seeing him until he'd made the transition to college, because he's gone from a school of 60 boys to a college of, I don't know how many, a couple of thousand students. We have our Cam's appointment on Thursday, and I have a feeling that it's going to be the last one now because he's not having medication. My concern is that, yes, if he deteriorates at all, if we come up against any new challenges, we're then going to be in the realm of adult mental health services. And I really don't know anything about that. I'm quite worried about, if we do reach that situation, having to then get a new referral and go through a whole different system is going to be an interesting experience.
Okay. In terms of that transition and that journey you're just about to go on then, and he is, if I can be of any support or advice there in terms of the work I do and how I do support young people to go to college and their families, then I will, help if I can.
Thank you. Let's have coffee.
Question over here. Just coming down the side.
First of all, thank you all very much for your most interesting presentations. And if I could just comment on the point that was made, particularly with regard to parents, and the restriction of services to a limited time. At Arcos, we see a great deal of this, and it's not only speech and language therapy, but it often is in the area of speech and language therapy or psychological treatment and counselling. And this restriction to 6 sessions is rather typical. And just when you feel that there's progress and everyone's getting straight, then the rug's pulled away from under the feet. Do any of you have any suggestions on how we can combat that, how one can procure more? Because our experience is that it's only when a crisis subsequently develops that anyone comes in. And we have a number of children coming to Arcos, including those who are excluded from school for challenging behaviour, and yet when they attend our centre and have more one-to-one, a more relaxed situation perhaps, not so much pressure, they present as entirely different from the people they're portrayed in the reports from the school, for example. Any suggestions on how to move forward?
There was a comment made before about about there being consistency across. I think it was in the parents' diagram you have about consistency, positive behaviour approaches being consistent. And I think that's the thing. I think there does need to be a long-term plan put in place. I mean, children have IEPs and sort of things like that, but yeah, in my experience, it is very much that crisis management. Something goes horribly wrong, and support's put there, and then it's taken away, and then you're just left back at square one. I don't have any solutions. More funding? I don't know.
I suspect some of the... there's no immediate solution to that in a way, obviously, but systemically, I suspect that some of the answer to it lies in health economics, in terms of gradually making the case of what is the cost of not providing that service, and what is the cost. It's a bit like the early intervention argument. Where will the money come from? What's the cost of not doing that versus what is the cost of doing it? And Richard may know a bit more health economic data than I do on challenging behaviour, but it's very sparse in the UK around challenging behaviour specifically, although Dawn Adams on our team has just done some work showing that in the last 6 months, the costs associated for a child with severe intellectual issues showing aggression or destroying the environment are significantly higher and around double for a child who has a similar degree of disability but not those problems. So that's within 6 months. So you can start to build this kind of health economics argument. The trouble is it takes quite a while to do that, and of course ultimately the question is, in 20 years' time, do we save money? I mean, we can't wait for that kind of answer, but I'd imagine there are some projections that we could clearly do that would make quite a strong case around that.
Can I just ask, do you have cost-benefit analysis, the same sort of figures, when it comes to looking at disabled children in households where there is a disabled adult? And I'm thinking of people who become disabled associated with managing a child, for example, with physical disability. You know, we see fathers with their hernias from lifting and mothers, with, both parents, in fact, with back problems. This adds to the cost, doesn't it? And also to the level of ability overall in that family. Recent work?
Yeah, a bit off my area,
Yeah,
I'm afraid,
a bit
but I don't
off
know,
mine.
colleagues and Warwick.
No, it's a bit off ours. But I just following on from what Chris was saying, I was having an interesting discussion with a group of families where in fact most of them had children with and sons and daughters with behaviour that challenges, and one of the parents made exactly this point in saying that politically there's everything for politicians and service providers to gain by doing expedient things in the short term, and politically and expediently there's not much in it for those individuals to plan in the long term. And that is a really big political issue, and one identified by this group of families, I think, very acutely.
I think, can I add to that? I think there are two processes that come up from what parents said in that infographic, which hopefully was useful. Two things there I think are important, especially when it comes to how to support families on a sort of episodic but also longer term basis when they have a child with quite challenging behaviour. It's not so much the problem that short-term interventions are a problem, but the fact that they're not connected, and that should you get to the stage where you need additional support, there's somehow a long lag, as Alison was talking about, before something happens. So the parents talked about two things. One was this idea of a key worker, which is obviously a familiar idea of having somebody who does support a family over a long period of time and can actually help to make sure that services are coordinated. And of course that's the kind of thing exactly that many local authorities have cut in terms of their support to families of disabled children, which is a real shame, clearly. So that's one mechanism that could be very useful. And the other that parents alluded to was this idea that positive behaviour support skills should be built within the service system much more broadly. And that's really about making sure there's proper local capacity and expertise, so that when children are particularly challenging with their behaviour and families face a number of difficulties, actually there will be local resources that can help them. And at the moment that's far too often too far away from home. So a local capacity building part of this is incredibly important, as well as that kind of key working. In fact, key working you'd need less of if there was much more competence and skills available locally.
I think possibly this is something which might come up this afternoon. I'd hope so, this whole business of how you take the evidence base and then use it to inform systems which are much, providing the consistency and all the things you mentioned. Anyway, we'll see, that'll be a little later. We have time for a couple more questions. One here, thank you.
Morning, my name's Karen Russell. I'm here in two capacities, a parent of a child with severe autism and severe learning disabilities, but also a community paediatrician. It was a very informative and interesting morning, so thank you to all the speakers. I had a question for Professor Oliver. It was really interesting to hear about your behavioural phenotype mapping onto the specific disorders that you discussed. I wondered, because I have my autism interest, we see lots of children diagnosed with autism, and it would be great if we could, at an early stage, predict somehow which cohort are going to go on to develop these very similar behavioural issues, so that we can do that early intervention. So, for instance, my son, I would never have had an idea, an inkling at 3 that he'd be where he is now. And is anyone doing that research?
Yeah, there is. Within our group, Caroline Richards has done some work on self-injury in autism, and interestingly, some of the risk markers you see in autism are no different from elsewhere. So greater severity of autism, scoring higher on an SEQ, for example, non-verbal or greater degree of intellectual disability, a behavioural marker of impulsivity, and that's really interesting. But that does predict in autism both future presence, but also future severity. And the last one is the scoring on repetitive behaviour. That might be tied up with severity of autism. And actually there's one more, which is health conditions, which may be a risk marker or maybe a risk factor, in other words, may drive self-injury. So actually in autism, a number of those things actually precede the development of clinically significant self-injurious or aggressive behaviour. So we do have the markers, and some of those are proving to be predictive. In another study, the presence of, just in children with severe intellectual disability, the presence of impulsivity and the presence of predicts the onset of aggression 18 months later, and the presence of repetitive behaviour predicts the onset of self-injury 18 months later. So there are these behavioural risk markers that are already there that help us in a way with the health economics argument as well, because one can then say, well, it's not a blanket approach. We're going to target a risk-related focus and risk-related resource that would hopefully offset later costs. I don't keep making this health economics. For me, the human cost is sufficient, but we are where we are. So there are these markers in autism, but also in all of the genetic disorders as well. The presence of autism predicts later self-injury. So we're getting there with a long list of risk markers now that can tell us about likelihood, quantify later likelihood.
Okay, thank you. We have time for just one brief question. The lady down here.
Yes, I'll stand up. I'm the mother of a teenager with severe autism and learning disability. I wanted to ask, I think probably Professor Oliver, or it might be some others, what do you think the essential services would look like to, not just for early intervention, but to help parents deal with challenging behaviour and particularly self-injurious behaviour? I mean, I speak as someone, there seems to be no services in my area. What should we be going for? What should we be asking for?
Well, I think for self-injury, I think there's a process that we would now work through. So there's growing evidence on pain and discomfort as a cause of self-injury. So it's less what services as opposed to what skills you need. So the identification of pain and discomfort in non-communicating children, and then if you can identify that, then having a service that is willing to actively pursue the cause of that, and then intervene. And I know that sounds a bit obvious, but sometimes it's quite hard to move through that sequence of identification, assessment, intervention for various reasons. So a good example is children with severe intellectual disability, autism and dental problems, and finding a service that will actually assess and intervene. And so that's always our first port of call. And then after that, it would be behaviour management strategies. And again, that's not necessarily tied to any particular profession. It would normally come with behaviour analysts or clinical psychology, but it's more the skill set that is important rather than the profession. And then they would need a particular set of skills around different methods of functional analysis, the most up-to-date behavioural interventions around functional communication training and so on, but also a real capacity for being able to translate those into practice in day-to-day settings rather than have them, as a set of interventions that one reels off. And the final thing, I think, then, is a team around the child of, that may be teachers or daycare or whatever it is, who are able to put those things into practice and to stick with them. So that's quite a long list of people. Well, no, it's not a long list of people, actually. It's people who are already there, but having the right skills and working through fairly systematically, I think.
If I could could just comment then, in my area, children with quite severe disabilities don't have regular checkups with a paediatrician. GP services are very, very fragmented. So actually identifying when a child is in pain is quite difficult because you don't have any continuity of care. Local paediatrician hadn't heard of positive behavioural support when I spoke to them. The local authority, I was talking to a senior person about a proper behavioural intervention support, and she said, oh yes, we've got that. We use ProAct Skip, which is one of the 38 approved restraint techniques. They think that she could not understand that behavioural approach went any further than restraint. And the local authority adopted a behavioural policy which wasn't identifying the needs of children with disabilities. It was all about restorative justice, and then page after page about safe restraint for those with learning disability. Where do we go when it's that bad?
Okay.
And there's no, and in CAMH they haven't got people with recognised behavioural qualifications.
Yeah. I think a lot of people would share that experience, and I'm certainly looking forward to the session this afternoon to hear about some of those initiatives and the ways in which those things which you might think are statutory responsibilities of provision, the way in which people might access those.
Okay, last
And I
point.
would also connect with the early intervention project that the Challenging Behaviour Foundation and Council for Disabled Children are running at the moment, because the kinds of things you identify are exactly what they're interested in. We're interested in making the argument that Chris is making, really, which is that early intervention is already established as an argument for working for children, for example, from more deprived circumstances in terms of their educational outcomes. And this is a specific group of children who need constructive early intervention support, and they're trying to make that broad case that given the broad interest in early intervention, it should also be applied to this group of children. So it'd be really worth making that contact and putting your weight behind that as well.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for your questions and observations. So we'll stop there and talk over lunch. Yes, thank you for your questions and comments and observations. Very big thank you to all our speakers this morning. Excellent talks. Thank you very much indeed. It's now lunchtime. So again, if you have a question, if you could put your hand up and please just say who you are, affiliation if you wish to, and who your question is directed at. So we have one question here. Thank you, to start us off.
Thank you. Questions to Nigel. As a permanent foster carer of a young disabled child who has quite complex health needs, which we believe are not being met adequately and appropriately by health services, are we eligible to refer this to the Ombudsman service, not being the corporate parent?
Okay, well, there's two aspects to that. I mean, the first thing is, have you already made a complaint, made formal concerns to the local authority? To
the hospital. Yeah.
Well, okay. So at the moment, not to the local authority.
No.
So, okay. Could you just describe a little bit more for me about the situation you're in before I can answer that? Then?
We've had 3 years of ongoing assessment for treatment, which is at the minute being declined, but that goes against all the evidence that we've given to the consultants, and never have they come back with a justifiable reason as to why he's not been started on the treatment.
Okay. It sounds to me, and we can talk afterwards, I'm very happy to talk afterwards, it sounds to me that you would be going through to the Health Service Ombudsman rather than to ourselves.
Right. Yeah.
But I would stress that we work together. We are actually developing a joint team. We work together already, but we're actually putting together a joint team for cases which have an element of both sides. It sounds to me it might be a case with an element of both local authority responsibility and health.
Yeah.
There's certainly an element of health. Could we talk about it afterwards? And I'm very happy to try to help with that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Can I just say that if this is a child in the care system, The 20... Ooh. Disembodied voice. The care system is now also part of my responsibility under the 2014 Act. The Children's Rights Director's Office at Ofsted was closed and all of those functions came to me. We take it tends to have to be the child or a child's advocate who speaks to us, but we are quite capable of then writing to the local authority concerned on behalf of that child. I'm not an ombudsman, but for the group of children who are in care receiving social care services or care leavers, I have kind of ombud light. Deal with it or you'll have to deal with me sort of powers. So do look on our website because there's an advice and assistance line if you need that sort of help. But it would be for the child, on the child's behalf, because they are his corporate parents. So.
Hello, my name's John Furlong. I'm a parent of a child with autism. I have a question for Nigel. It's about jurisdiction and about the new Children and Families Act. Excuse me. The Ombudsman doesn't have jurisdiction over schools, as far as I know. I know that there was a trial period where you did, and obviously the vast majority of children with SEN don't have a statement or an EHC plan. So I was wondering for a comment from you whether you think having jurisdiction of schools back would be a good thing. And related to that is the government is working on a accountability framework for local authorities following the Children and Families Act. So that's kind of your area too. So I was wondering if you had any input into that or what your view on that framework is.
Okay. First part of the question, you're absolutely right. We don't have jurisdiction over schools, although because the talking about SEN statements, I realise that it's now become very quickly historical because that's the responsibility of the local authority primarily, and it has an impact. The school service has an impact. We are entitled to look. It's a delicate balance, but we're entitled to look holistically at the problem if it's a problem about a statement of special educational needs. So we can ask questions, we can make inquiries, and we can hopefully investigate if there's a difficulty about a statement not being put into place. Okay, but you're absolutely right. We don't have jurisdiction over schools. It was wheeled out at the beginning of this current government. 10% of schools were brought within our jurisdiction on a pilot basis. We were very keen. That was evaluated. It was very positive. That's also on our website. But it was a decision not to go any further. You're asking my view about whether I think it would be good for us to have jurisdiction back. I absolutely would, but it's not for me to say whether that will or I suppose should happen. But my own personal experience was that we were able to resolve a lot more difficult situations having that additional jurisdiction. The second part of the question, I'm afraid I don't have an answer for. I don't have any knowledge of.
And neither do I, but you can see from my body language that I'd like to pick up on the ombud question. We did some very pointed and targeted work in a very formal inquiry. When we run a formal inquiry, it's like a select committee. You can't say, I can't come, I'm busy. And we use a stenographer and take detailed and verbatim records of what's said and so on. And our first, under those powers, was into education exclusion. And you will not be surprised to hear me say that both illegal, because there is no such thing as unofficial, it's illegal exclusion, and inequality in exclusion most stringently affected children with special educational needs, and secondly, with long-term and lifelong medical conditions. And we threw a variety of bombs into the fish pond. For me, I'm actually not bothered who runs schools. I used to work for a local authority, but most schools in that local authority are now academies. And there are free schools and so on. And there are some stupendously good academy groups and trusts and chains and people who work with each other and with the local authority still, and may well be making the most of their freedoms for children rather than for some ideology or other. There is no education ombudsman. And in a diversifying system, it strikes me that there very possibly ought to be. you have the Academy Trust to go to, or the diocese, or the whoever else to go to. And if all that fails and your local authority doesn't have the power over the bit of the school's work that you're complaining about, the only next place you can go is the Education Funding Agency, which is not set up properly to deal with or delve into the complaints that you might bring. And if your local authority isn't the backstop because it's not an LA school and the issue that you're complaining about is not an LA governed action anymore because it's devolved or delegated, where else are you going to go? And there isn't an education ombud. You've got one for banking, you've got one for pensions, you've got one for the telly, you've got one for your council, you've got one for your parliamentarian, your health service, but not for your school. And there are 7 million children in English schools. Just in English schools, there are 7 million children. And there isn't an ombudsman. And I think there ought to be.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Alison Thompson. I'm the mum of a boy with special needs, and also I'm starting to work with parents who have children with special needs as well. Maggie, as a society, we seem to be a long way behind implementing any of the promises in in any of the children's rights in the treaty, especially when it comes to kids with complex needs. So as individuals, as parents, as professionals, what can we do to start making a difference?
Well, there is a statutory requirement on every Director of Children's Services and every lead member in an English local authority to pay what's called due regard to the Convention. The Convention is not binding in law in any nation. So if any of you have come from Wales, where you've got a child's rights measure, it's still not binding in law. And, you know, that's the sticking point. We have not incorporated it into British law. But this government, of all governments actually, has made more promises to take account of what's in the Convention than any previous government. If you get a message ever from a DFE official, there should be a strapline at the bottom that says, do you know about the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child? Edward Timpson has it in his ministerial remit. He also has special educational needs and the care system. So the possibility of exercising your political muscle, I do wish we were Scots. My stepchildren are Scottish, and the awakening of the Scottish political consciousness, whatever happened on September the 18th, has been remarkable. And that's what we need to do as a nation. We need to wake up to the fact that we elect the people who represent us, and if we don't vote, we get what we deserve. But we elect them, and they are responsible for running our society and setting its laws. But your director and lead member of Children's Services must have due regard, in the same way as they must have due regard for many, many, many other things. And paying due regard means paying due regard. So start there, I would say, and then talk to your MP, and find out how they vote and how they intend to push. We can only do it by influence. You know, I'm tiny. I've got 19 pence per English child in my office and fewer than 30 staff. I do it by influence and by kind of sprinkling fairy dust on people and saying, there you go, you now know about the United Nations Convention. And it's beginning to work, but it's slow. It's slow. And if there's another group that you really do need to push, it's the media, who castigate and stereotype all too easily and all too lazily. Where are these feral children if there are 500,000 scouts and 500,000 guides and about 250,000 cadets and about 250,000 Duke of Edinburgh award candidates and so on and so? Where are they?
Tracy.
Thank you. Just wanted to make you walk down here, really, that's all.
You can have it back.
Yeah, I'm Chris Jones. I'm the Chief Executive of Cerebra, and my question is for Maggie. What is the reason for the reticence on the part of the United States over being a signatory? Is it its fear of its litigious nature? And linked to that, is there any empirical observation or evidence that would substantiate their apprehensions? In other words, is that of which they are afeard ever been shown to be a reality for those countries that have become signatories?
Well, as I said in my opening remarks, signing it and actually living by it are two very different things in every nation that's ever signed it, actually. So South Sudan and Somalia and Syria and Egypt and all of those nations have signed it, as have we. I would question whether the bedroom tax is actually a fulfilment of the rights of the child. So every nation that's ever signed it falls short. It's such an aspirational set of very general promises and entitlements. My understanding from talking to American academics is that there is a very grave mixture of things going on in the American psyche. They have a universal declaration of the rights of man by which they hold. And they salute the flag every morning and they talk about the freedom and liberty and equality for all and all of those things every day in their schools. I think they feel that such a strong and strident declaration of the rights of man will do, actually, is one of the things. But I also think, from talking to the same American academics, that the fear of a fundamentalist backlash from very directive and fairly heavily disciplinarian faith groups of all sorts is one of the things that they fear. And I think they do fear being a country where almost the first thing you do is go and see your attorney when there's something that's not quite right, because you're free to do that as an American citizen. And it's encouraged. So there is a movement, there is a groundswell towards America, which has, you know, the UN headquarters and goodness only knows what else it doesn't have, and a very strongly rights-based, people died for the vote sort of culture, in the same way as we do, although we've forgotten. The very strong possibility that the US will actually come into the fold is always dangling like a tantalising thing over here somewhere. Fingers crossed. If you know any Americans, talk to them. Wait for the mic.
Hi, my name's Tanya. I'm Canadian. Been here 25 years.
Oh, well,
and
you signed, so you're all right.
I just thought I'd put that in there somewhere. I don't know how much they apply these rights in Canada, because I've been here 25 years, so I'm kind of not in the loop. I was trying to formulate a question succinctly, so just cut me off because I'm really struggling to find the words for it. I've got a child with very complex needs who's been mainly straight through education in mainstream, and a strong believer in inclusion and empowering and solutioning things in the simplest possible way for both the people in school, people in community, and my child, demystifying it, making it less complicated than it needs to be, and just having a really happy life. I'm very, very blessed with the child I have. And I used to really understand the previous system, done the tribunal a couple of times quite successfully, and he, even if he's in the lower percentage for severe communication needs, he's up for anything, he's got severe sensory needs, and he's very well accepted and really happy kind of guy. So a strong proponent for continuing those therapies and staying local, I think, is where I stand. But I feel a little bit, you reminded me about the Year 9 review. Oh my God, sorry. I'm wondering what are the next course, the next thing I should do, if you have any idea, because obviously you guys are very much in the know. Still say you guys, apologies. Because I don't know the new system, who does right now. I've been at the NACE and implementation events and tried to wrap my head around it. And he, like most of the children we're probably talking about today, he doesn't fit a specific school or whatever. So mainstream is the closest, best deal for him, but I'm very much proponent of a blended learning platform. So I'm part of the solution, his community is. There's some flexibility. He comes in and out of school and it keeps growing, and we're opening up those channels. But how do I make that make sense within the new system without him falling short, because he's not anywhere near the classic approach to how he learns and uses, his schooling, basically, because he's not always in school for 5 days full time. And I'm wondering if there's something coming up or anything so I can keep learning, so I can keep on making those opportunities happen for him when he's being switched into the next wonderful, mysterious thing that is the new plan. Yeah, that's me in a nutshell. That's my question. Good luck with that.
I'm not sure that I know of anything that's coming up, but I mean, my personal view about this is that you need to be talking about your son's needs to those who are closest to meet and best placed to meeting those needs, and talking at a time. Clearly, it sounds like it's now a time which is suited to you. So I wouldn't personally be waiting for the next thing that's coming up. I would be ensuring that you have those discussions, that you are clear about what you think is best for him, but you're also listening to the views of those who are working with him. What we've seen a lot of are systems that, for one reason or another, don't plan ahead at the right time. They don't foresee what I guess is pretty much a foreseeable event, is moving on to the next stage transition. And all I would say is make sure that you are making those appointments, making sure that you're talking to those people who sound like, from what you've said, they're doing a pretty good job, and all is going, I think, as well as it could do.
So basically, continue this kind of finding some doable solutions, talking about how they relate to positive outcomes, both in terms of how it's worked to date and how we see that grow, and then all the stakeholders involved with him, making them aware and buy into it, and then baking lots of muffins and try to bring them on board.
For me, what you've just described is what was in Sarah Tether and her advisors' heads all the way back when she first decided that what she needed to do was to try to free up the system so that it could better flex and work around the child and the family from as early as possible rather than waiting until it's late. You sound as if, if I flip your coin and it lands heads up, you sound as if you hold so many of the cards of knowledge and of expertise and of support and of community that your child is going to continue to need. You're absolutely right. The needs of the child are not just suddenly going to go away when he wakes up when he's 15. This is it, And what you need is the most fulfilled possible life and the services around him to gather around him in a circle and do what needs to be done. With or without the formal state documentation, but always with a pathway back through the complaints systems and back towards the Ombudsman if you need it. And it also sounds as if you are in one of these what I call dual ombuds families, in that some of his needs are about health. And there is a health ombud who is actually very switched on to these things. And don't forget that as commissioning for health goes further and further and further down towards the locality, and it's the clinical commissioning groups who've got the money, the oversight is also local. There is a health watch in your area, which is overseen by both health and local government, and is very strongly about the patient's experience and pushing back hard when the patient's experience is not right. There will be a local chair and a local health watch, which is dedicated and designated to help you to do that.
Thank you very much.
Question up there.
Thank you. It's a question for Maggie Atkinson, really. I'm a PhD student at Cardiff Law School. And
you've got time to sit in a conference? Well, what's wrong with you?
I was really struck this morning, two speakers spoke about kind of having battles with services, and one speaker actually phrased it as services cause additional stress to the carer, which I thought was a really striking statement. And I'm a sibling of somebody with autism, and 50 years ago, that's half a century ago, we were dealing with that issue, and we're still dealing with that issue. And you mentioned austerity. You spoke about the 2010 election. Program's going to be cut regardless. And nobody at the moment seems to be questioning this discourse of austerity. We're in a process of savage cuts. And I'm wondering, really, do you think there's a risk that we're replacing services with rights? We're talking a lot about rights, and it seems to me that we're arguably talking less about services. And I'm just wondering if you think there's a risk that that could be happening?
And I think there is a risk if one isn't backed by the other. When I challenge government about the rights issues that I'm talking about, there is like there are in that report. There is always a clutch of, and to hold you to account for the delivery of those rights. This is what you have to do in terms of both commissioning and provision, and the evaluation with the parent and the child as to whether what you said you were going to deliver has been delivered and is of high enough quality. Rights will never stand simply on their own. They're ephemera. They're party balloons. You know, they have to be backed by what it means to live those rights. And the UN committee is just as fervent on that as the 4 UK Children's Commissioners are. So there is one, you'll probably know him, in Wales, Keith Towler, and there's one in Scotland, one in Northern Ireland. And we gather for our European, there are 28 of us in Europe. And we gather in Edinburgh for our annual 2-day convention in about 3 weeks' time. So you can't swear the promises and then not deliver. So part of the point at which I get very sand in the eyes of the government is when I say, it's in the convention, it's in the law, this is the proof you're not delivering. Why are you not delivering? You've written the law, and the law backs the convention, and the convention backs the law, and you're still not delivering. So we've said some very uncomfortable things about welfare and poverty and continued growth of numbers. And I am, to some degree, a thorn in the government's side, but that's why we're here. In just the same way, sometimes the LGO or the Health Service and Parliamentary Ombudsman say stinging things, the difference being that they have the power to make it stick. And as Children's Commissioner, I just have the power to tell the story. So, but I think one without the other won't do. You can sign up to anything you like. If you're not going to make it happen, why have you signed?
Afternoon. Karen Russell, a parent of a severely disabled, autistic and learning disabled child, and a community paediatrician, so 2 hats.
And a knitter.
Yes, indeed, a multitasker. And anyway, my question is probably aimed at yourself, Nigel. We often see, and personal experience has shown me that, I think we've already alluded to, the extreme stress that lack of access to services gives parents and carers. And I see parents who are going through and they just want to get through this battle. They don't want to make an official complaint. They don't want to get the ombudsman right then. It eventually, maybe 18 months down the line, is resolved, whether it's been with judicial review, whether it's been through a tribunal, whatever. Can they historically go back and say, right, this process was, didn't support us, was inappropriate, and make a complaint either officially, directly to the services or through the ombudsman?
You say go back after what?
So for instance, part of the social care assessment, the process took 18 months to get from I need some more help to actually having a package delivered, and that's just unacceptable. But while they're trying, or to an appropriate school or whatever, while they're going through that process, they can't even find that energy within themselves, because they're very vulnerable to also make an official complaint and get the ombudsman involved. So it eventually gets resolved. They've got a care package, the child's at appropriate school, whatever. But actually the process is going on for other families coming behind them. You look behind your shoulder and I can see the waiting room full of the same families going through the same thing. So at that point, can a family who now feels stronger because they've got an appropriate package say, right, I'm going to make this, I'm going to take this somewhere. Where do they take it? Where do they say this was wrong and I don't want it happening to those families?
You can do, but there are some caveats around there. So in order to come to us, we will look at historic issues, but there has to be some injustice. So if you are in a position where everything's worked out and there's nothing wrong any longer, we'd be unlikely to investigate that because we are driven by personal injustice. The other thing to say is that you'd have to have some reason to come to us. If it's more than 12 months after something came to your attention, then we've got discretion to look at it, but we'd think, well, why didn't you come to us sooner? Having said both of those things, as long as there are answers to both those questions, and I suspect the injustice one, a delay, a considerable delay, does bring with it injustice, even if things have been fixed, usually. There's no reason why we wouldn't look at those matters. As long as you hadn't delayed unreasonably and that there was some justification over 12 months, and as long as that you were claiming injustice and there was a reasonable argument, then we would probably look at it. Does that make sense? I know there's lots of caveats, but...
I guess my other, sort of along those lines, would you have had to make a formal complaint to the local authority?
Yeah.
Because I think you mentioned that when you were talking to another
with anything, again, there is discretion for us to look at it if we so desire. But with anything, our first question is, okay, has this gone through the local system we'd normally expect it to have gone through? Because we want things to be fixed locally. We want things to be sorted out there. Sometimes it hasn't for good reason, but it would have to be, again, it would have to be a clear reason why it couldn't or didn't go through the local system. But generally, yes, you would have to raise it as a complaint.
I think maybe one final question here, and then we must break for tea.
This one's for you, Maggie. When your post of office comes to an end, let's just say, for example, that you did have to go back to a role as Director of Children's Services, knowing what you know now and everything that you passionately embrace, how would you cope with delivering children's services on an ever-reducing budget?
I'd have to start with the most vulnerable and work upwards from there, to be honest. But I'd also want to do a great deal more than I managed. The Director of Children's Services issues were still relatively in their infancy when I left in 2010. I would want to work far more stringently with the other partners who should be co-funding and co-running the system than I managed as a local authority Director of Children's Services then. So, for instance, when I got to the 99th statement of special educational needs that was delayed because we couldn't get a speech and language therapist anywhere near us because they were all doing strokes, I paid for speech and language therapy out of the local authority budget. I know of no Director of Children's Services who could afford to do that anymore. So I would want some hold their feet to the fire power granted to me by my chief executive and theirs and my elected members and things like the 2014 Act to really push hard on vulnerability and marginalisation. The difficulty then being that I know that my former colleagues have pushed incredibly hard on not letting go of the statutory services. Anything that's discretionary in almost every local authority I've ever been in, apart from Inner London, which is still burning £5 notes to keep itself warm, in every other local authority in the country, the early intervention, the discretionary, the preventative, the respite, the stuff that is not bound by a law, has either withered or is being delivered extremely patchily and to fewer and fewer and fewer people. What local government tells me is that the cuts have not yet started in most areas. The rows that go on between, is it old people, is it children, is it gritting the roads and making sure nobody dies, is it libraries, is it culture, is it keeping the roads safe, is it mending potholes, will not go away, is my prediction. I would go back into local government, but I would want to go back with everything the last 4.5 years has taught me about partnership and about valuing the voice of those who could probably give you far more creative ideas about how things ought to be, and they're usually the service users. So I would want to go back more humble than I left. And I'm not denying it's a very, very, very tough job. Very tough. Very tough.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, thank you all. Microphones are coming around. Question over there.
Thanks very much. My name is Jan Baines. I'm head teacher of a special school in Gloucestershire. I've got a question about the local offer. I understand quite a bit about the local offer, obviously, around my role. But one of the things that I've realised, we deal with 8 local authorities, and what they've done with the local offer is really quite interesting. I know there's a duty to provide or produce a local offer. Is there a duty regarding the level of access for the information within the local offer?
The regulations in relation to the local offer are actually really quite prescriptive in terms of the level of detail. So Schedule 2 to the Act has a very, very long list of all of the information that must be published in the local offer, and then that local offer must go on the local authority's website. And in addition, considering their duties under the Equality Act and making things accessible, they have to have the opportunity for people to access that local offer as a hard copy form. Whether they decide to put it in libraries or whether they decide to put it, in schools, there has to be the opportunity to have a hard copy available as well. And that's, I guess, one of the parts of the consultation about the local offer, is deciding how you make that accessible. And that's your opportunity, I guess, to say to the local authority, this is where we want the local offer to go, if it's in addition to the website.
Okay, thank you. Just to give you an idea, in my experience, it's fairly impenetrable, the systems that they've chosen to enable people to access. I mean, I regard myself as being reasonably intelligent, but I couldn't find certain institutions, organisations through the obvious searches you might do. So just a bit of feedback. Thank you.
Right, shall we start at the top? Give you a bit of exercise.
Hi, I've come today as a parent of a child with complex needs, but actually my question is about speech and language therapy, because I'll put my head above the parapet and say I am a speech and language therapist, something I tend to keep very quiet at events like this, for obvious reasons. I've struggled. My child's functionally non-verbal. I don't know whether that says much about me or anyway, whatever. My question is the traditional battle with getting the speech and language therapy provision in Part 3, so it becomes an educational provision, so we can get the educational people to pay for it. What happens now? Because you said that the health part can be enforced, but I know for a fact that they're cutting percentages of our speech therapy budgets every year and asking us to be more efficient and more effective. And speech therapy services, at least the 2 that I've had most experience with recently, are developing a real bunker mentality and becoming very defensive. And it's a very uncomfortable position for me in both my roles. I'm not supposed to say anything to parents about education. I've had my hand slapped about that before. But what could I say? Where do we stand now with the speech and language therapy provision? Does it have to be in a specific section?
Yes, it does.
Right.
So the Code of Practice is really clear and, in fact, doesn't really change the position from the previous law. So the test for what goes in the SEN section of the plan, which was the equivalent of Part 3, the test is whether the provision educates or trains the child. So you have to demonstrate that that particular therapy educates or trains, and as long as it educates or trains, it has to go in the SEN section of the plan.
That's fantastic. Can I ask you one more question really quickly? I've been told before that that statements would only be issued to children who needed a certain amount of one-to-one support. Whereas, in my opinion, even if they were entitled to 1 hour, say, of speech and language therapy support, they should be entitled to it. Is there a minimum criteria that's been laid out for children who would be entitled to one of these new EHC plans?
So the test for an EHC plan is exactly the same as the test for a statement of SEN. It hasn't changed. Okay. And I think you should be very cautious of any blanket policies which say you will only be eligible if X, Y or Z is met, because it needs to be based on an assessment of that child or young person's needs. And the test is whether that child has special educational needs which require an EHC plan to be made. So yeah, look out, I think, for those blanket policies, because they will be unlawful.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Now, we had 2 or 3 people in the middle. Yeah.
again, dual role, parent of a uniquely perfect child and a family advocate at his profound needs school. I suppose this is directed towards you, Luke. I have actually spoken to you from Columbus before, but we've had an issue just arise, and it's so laughable that I just would like a little bit of guidance. Children have to stay in school now till they're 18, and we go up to 19. And because I've been based on college campus since the return of the academic year, a lot of it is falling past me. But we have the situation where parents, if they had a mainstream child, regarding child benefit, you have to say what qualification or accreditation your child will get from being in that further education up to 18. Unfortunately, our children are of the capacity that they won't actually attain an accreditation because most of them aren't toilet trained, they can't talk, etc. It's life skills and it's respite. That doesn't fit the new computer programme. Therefore, they cannot claim child benefit, which seems apt. And we've been ringing left, right and centre saying, this is ridiculous. You change your computer system, and it's like that old act, you know, the computer says no. No, I understand, but the computer says no. That is going to not just obviously impact on our children at Columbus School and College in Chelmsford, it's going to go right across the country. And I can't believe that somebody has just missed that injustice because the computer says no.
I really don't want difficult questions, if that's all right. We've said this before. I've not come across that. That's really interesting. If that is so, that's extraordinary. But of course, that might be that it's in the primary legislation, the Social Security legislation. And of course, the Social Security legislation is allowed to discriminate. It's not vulnerable to a challenge under the Equality Act. It would be vulnerable to a challenge under the European Convention. But I have never heard that. That's fascinating. You must email me that. I'd really be interested in that. Yeah. Yeah.
And then we're ringing up saying we'll sort it out.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, I'm sorry, the computer says no, because you're not.
Yeah. I mean, it could be. I mean, if it's in the presumably, it actually would be in the regulations, and the courts could strike the regulations down. But it may just. I've not heard that problem, and as you say, it is extraordinary. And that's a case where you're applying the same rule to disabled and non-disabled people, so it's clearly indirectly discriminatory. But I mean, if somebody else has heard that before, but email me up and we'll take it up with the department.
Hi, just a quick question about the local offer. I've really struggled to find anything to do with looked after children regarding that. Now, previously we've found that we were excluded from local services because the child came from a different authority, and I wondered whether there's any guidance on what will happen with the local offer, whether it will be whether they'll get it from the area that they live in or the area that the parents are.
There is a provision in Schedule 2 of the Act which says that the local offer must contain information about services and provision out of that area if it's likely that children are going to access that provision out of area. So if there's if you have a local authority which makes use of particular residential placements, for example, but they're out of area, those are the sorts of things which ought to be going in the local offer. So there definitely should be something in the local offer about it.
Right, okay.
Okay, did you...
Hello, another speech and language therapist, and I'm sitting beside another one as well. We're coming out of the woodwork here. And it's important that we should come out of the woodwork, because speech and language therapy, which of course addresses such centrally important aspects of one's own being, really, whether you're thinking of education or the rest of life, the ability to communicate and to eat, drink and swallow is really pretty important to all of us. And I have to say that working outside the NHS, in which I worked for a considerable number of years, and indeed in higher education, working in a voluntary organisation, it is interesting, it's extremely frustrating at times, and I just want to say a couple of things. And these are the things that we are finding, that I think, recognised difficulty in finding evidence for the success of therapies, not just speech and language therapy, but other therapies, is challenging. We don't have traditionally the quantitative and qualitative research base that would make it easy for us to say, we're going to do this, and here's the proof that it's going to work. Particularly in a culture now, as we have, where speech and language therapists, and I believe colleagues in other therapy disciplines, may get to see an individual, but then they're required to write a program to be delivered by other individuals who have not the skills that they have. That can cause a problem. And I think it does cause a problem, given that there is not usually a facility even for TAs, for teaching assistants, those giving individual support to children, to have training in the specialist ways that the therapist would be wanting to be employed. And then we have the self-fulfilling prophecy, the chicken and egg bit, that is about saying this child shouldn't have speech and language therapy because their communication is in line with their cognitive level. And, well, there you have it. Often the cognitive level, because of the complex difficulties the child has and the shortage of psychologists, it ain't testable, or it hasn't been tested. But now the bit about being in the voluntary sector, now that we are having, we didn't expect to have, but we are having parents beating a path to the door and begging to pay. We don't expect people to pay. We didn't expect people to pay. We thought our services would be absolutely commissioned. And they sometimes are commissioned, but not very often by the NHS or education services, unless they're pushed by particularly articulate families usually. But the situation is that when parents do get their child into some speech and language therapy, for instance, at our cost, guess what? It seems that the local statutory service suddenly finds that it does have the possibility of treating the child. And that's a matter of concern, really, isn't it? It means that we're not able to achieve the level of flexibility, for instance, that's been stressed. We're not able to really look at the problem in a reasonable way and to find a proportional way of dealing with it at the moment. And I think that the austerity that's been mentioned is very much there. And people are frightened to step outside the frame. People are afraid of losing their jobs. Thank you.
Do you want to comment on it? Or not?
No, it's really... And it's not just true that it's often applied behavioural analysis and stuff like that. You have to fund it first before you can then get some statutory funding for it. You know, and if you can't afford that, or you don't come from those sort of family networks, then it's awful.
I mean, I guess the only thing that I would add is that the legal rights are there to resolve all of those problems you have just raised. So in relation to the concern about TAs not having speech and language training, well, a proper, good quality EHC needs assessment and a properly specified and quantified EHC plan should set out really clearly exactly what training should be provided to TAs and how often, a specific time allocated. And the Code of Practice says all of that should happen. And I think also in relation to that lack of flexibility, again, direct payments offers us that solution so that parents could now say, well, rather than taking statutory therapy services, I would like to take a direct payment and go to a service like yourself and pay privately for the provision which is in the statement. So the opportunities are there under the legal framework that we have to resolve all of the problems that you have said. It's just about parents understanding they have those rights and knowing about how to enforce them, I think.
I think the difficult Am I on? I think that the difficulty about that, what do the rest of you think, is that often the parents are worn out with just getting through life and taking on all the extra energy-demanding tasks that are involved in that. Is just too much, and we find ourselves continually being asked to help, to support. And, you know, that there are only so many hours in the day. But I just want to make one last point, and it's very important.
Very, very briefly, please.
I'm sorry. When ARCOS started, we didn't expect to be working in medical legal cases. Now our therapists do take on a medical legal work, and there's an enormous difference between the provision that can be made available when there is personal injury compensation, for instance. And it does emphasise the two-tier services.
Okay, thank you. The lady here has been waiting for some time.
Hi. Hi, my name is Leah. I'm a parent of a child with autism. My question is for Polly. You said that about you have no rights to appeal in the relation to the outcome on the session of the EAGC plan. So if we do not agree with what the local authority put on that session, what can we do? Even if we have our private assessments, private reports, and they decided to put what they want to do with their own professionals and don't accept what we took to them.
So the outcome section of the plan, you can't appeal it to tribunal, so you are left with your remedies which you currently have, which is going through the local authority's complaint system and then potentially going to the local government ombudsman, but we all know that takes a very long time. Or considering judicial review, a legal remedy. So you do have legal remedies, but it wouldn't be going to tribunal. So you would be going to tribunal about other parts of the child's SEN, but not about the outcome section.
Because the outcome, the more important part, that you be the reason what provision is going to be given to the child.
Yeah.
I'm aware that we can't take all the questions. There have been 2 or 3 other hands go up, but we do need to draw it to a close. Maybe there'll be a quick opportunity to have a word with you afterwards for those who haven't been included. So just finally, many thanks to Polly and Luke for their excellent talks and for the answers to the questions. So thank you.